Hey leaders, we are back to normal youth schedule this week in 2015. Happy New Year. I'm so glad that we get to continue in ministry together, and I really look forward to what this year holds for our team and for our students together as we continually grow in our relationships with each other and our relationships with God. So we're going to dive right in. The new series that we're launching into is called No Limits, and what better way to start the new year than a series called No Limits, because with the new year comes a set of resolutions, and we say we want to work out more, we want to save more money, we want to do our chores, we want to study more, we want to be better at work, and nothing is wrong with any of those things. But for our high schoolers, I'm going to ask a very kind of tough question by the end of the night. As we look at this idea of no limits, these resolutions might seem small once I get the chance to ask a little bit of a tougher question. We don't want to abandon those things because they're all good, resolutions are good, but I want to challenge our high school students, and for the middle school students, behind those resolutions can be one main theme, and that theme is that we want to be blank, fill in that blank with whatever resolution, so that we have influence. God wants that for us, and God desires so much more for us that our influence has no limits when we can lean into what God calls us to. Now, some of us kind of react in different ways, especially students will think, well, I don't know if I'm up for that, or I don't know if I want this, or I don't know if I'm qualified for that kind of a discussion. And we'll find good company with the character we're going to spend the majority of the series looking at. And we're looking at the book of Exodus, looking at Moses' life and kind of Moses' journey with limits that were put on him, limits that he put on himself, and areas where God stepped in and said, no, when you lean into me, you have no limits. You have no idea the plan that God has in store. So we first meet Moses in the second chapter of the book of Exodus, and it's one of the first books in the Bible. He's just a baby. Moses was born in the middle of a great tension between the Egyptian and the Hebrew people. The Egyptians were the big bad guys, the Hebrews are the little good guys, and Egypt was in a huge empire in the world, and like most empires of that day, they managed a lot of growth and progress through slave labor, and that was the lot of the Hebrews, the slaves to the empire. So as they grew in numbers, Egypt's leader, Pharaoh, saw that there was a population threat from the Hebrew people. So he said at the snap of his fingers, made a law, every newborn baby boy born to an Israelite must be put to death. Some of you may remember this story. I'm just going to run through it so we have a good background to launch into this series with, that the story of how Moses came to be. Now, into that world, Moses is born. And this is where the story gets interesting. In an effort to save her son's life, Moses' mother puts him in a basket and floats him down a river to what she hopes would be safety. Now, crazy enough, but baby Moses ends up floating down the river straight where Pharaoh's daughter was at. And she looks and says, look, it's a cute baby. I think I'll keep him. And she takes the baby from the riverbank and decides to raise him, which immediately makes Moses Egyptian royalty. But the tension between the Israelites and Egyptians didn't appear, and in fact, one day when Moses was older, after seeing a Hebrew slave being treated badly by an Egyptian, Moses loses it, kills the Egyptian, and Moses' story doesn't end there. So Moses has murdered somebody. The murder turns out to be a problem for Moses. He gets found out, has to flee for his life, so Moses goes off the reservation, gets out of Dodge. Moses flees out of Egypt to a nearby town called Midian. Now there, Moses gets married, has a son, settles into life as a shepherd. So he went from a prince to a nobody overnight. This is as low profile as he could keep. But just as Moses is getting comfortable with the idea of living out his years anonymously, in his small corner of the world, God steps in. Before we look at the interaction between God and Moses, I want to take time to just remember the limits and the objections of influence that Moses ran into and that we put on ourselves sometimes. For Moses, those limits were, he was a murderer on the run. He was disliked by the Egyptians for running away. He was disliked by the Hebrew people for making their miserable lives already worse because now they're slaves and Pharaoh's probably pretty upset. And now Moses is a nomad, a shepherd in the middle of nowhere. And really his entire social circle was related to him. So it's crazy to see the limits that Moses could put on himself in this moment. So as we look at the story, we see that he's tending to his flock. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 1 is where it starts. He's tending to his flock, sees a bush that's on fire, but it's not burning up. And at this point he goes, I'll go over and see what this is about. Now there's nothing holy quite yet. There's nothing crazy quite yet. We see curiosity in Moses. And the next part talks about that when the Lord sees that Moses has gone over, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, I am here. Now that's a big deal because even as a shepherd or an ex-murderer, God knew exactly where Moses was. God knew the limits that Moses was in. And God knows where you are too. God knows where our students are too. He hasn't forgotten about us. He hasn't given up on us. And so there's another dialogue that takes place where God says, do not come any closer. You're on holy ground. And Moses hides his face because he was afraid to look at God. Now this is when it gets real. This is when things start getting heated up. That at this point, God is recognizing and noticing the cries and the heartbreak of his people, the Israelites, in slavery in Egypt. So God decides to do something. God notices and desires better for them. God notices and desires better for you and I. Do you think the Israelites even thought that this was possible? The Israelites probably thought that their new life was this slavery. Their new limit was this slavery. There was nothing else they could do. And so now we see how we end our scripture for this Sunday. In chapter 3, verse 10, it says, so go now. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. God says, go, Moses, I'm sending you. Moses goes, me? Why me? And God says, yes, you. Now for our high schoolers, I want to ask a big question here. I want to ask, what breaks your heart? What breaks your heart when you think of something and you go, it melts you on the inside, it upsets you? Let that be a resolution this year to change that world in a small or big way. Not the world. Change that world, the part that your heart breaks. Now, God might not speak to you through a burning bush and tell you where to go and to do that, but God puts these passions in our hearts. And if we follow those, we're following God's call in our lives. And we look at the rest of the conversation between Moses and God in part 2 of this series. But for now, I want us to notice that big influence starts with a small step. Big influence starts with asking a difficult question of what breaks your heart? And what are you doing to do that? What are you doing to step out in faith and have influence in that moment? Before Moses got all the details, God's first order of business was to get Moses moving in that direction. And today, Moses' influence still continues thousands of years later because he took a small step. And that's the question I'm going to ask our middle schoolers. What's the step in front of you right now? We'll tie that back into what the high schoolers are dealing with what breaks your heart? What is the step that you can take to be a mission and to be in a movement with God in the area that breaks your heart? What relationship is in front of you? What opportunity is in front of you? What are you limiting yourself with that you can give to God and realize that you have big influence and it starts with a small step? Whatever the great obstacles, or whatever it is, the greatest obstacle we face in this is excuses. Like any good resolution, any good New Year's resolution, we make excuses. We say, I'm too busy, I'm too tired, I'm just not going to be able to do it. Excuses will get in the way. But God's inviting us to be part of a greater story. God invited Moses to be part of a greater story that is limitless. And we put limits on ourselves all the times as Christians, saying we're too young, we're too old, we're too this, we're too that. We're like Moses. We have no idea what God has in store for us. So we take a small step and trust that He will catch us on the move. That big influence starts with a small step. Now, as we look at small groups, I want us to think about the potential for influence that's around us right now. That burning inside of us of what breaks our hearts for high school students, that's potential for influence. And I want us to ask God to show up and show us where to move next. So I'm really excited for this series. It'll really hopefully show us how big God's heart is and God's plan is for our lives. That we do not have limits if we can lean in and trust God and take off the limits of the world and the limits we put on ourselves. So looking forward to it. I think it'll be a great way to kick off the new year as we look as a time to reset and restart sometimes in our lives. So we'll see you at 4:15 for our leader meeting, and looking forward to it. See you Sunday.